He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. This week we look at how the media handled a rash of resignations from top public jobs. Not always perfectly.
What marked his time as Governor-General, Bernard?
Firstly,
Reserve Bank
when he
Governor,
got in from...
Whoops.
And how Wellington's water woes hit the headlines again. No resignations there, but plenty of news stories. But first, the publisher of the Herald, NZME, has told its investors it's going to set a new tone for New Zealand and also share stories of economic success and positive momentum. And they also plan to roll out AI to shape the Herald's homepage. And all that really will change what we see and read in the future. But NZME's top brass now have another, more acute problem. A billionaire who's backed alternative online news outlets here has bought a decent chunk of the company, and now he wants to take control of the whole thing.
Auckland-based Canadian Jim Grenon has told the company's board he wants to remove most of the current directors. Concern is now growing amongst journalists and staff about a possible move or a shift in editorial direction.
That was Ryan Bridge, the host of Newstalk ZB's Drive Show, with the startling news that sent a shiver through his own newsroom, and the Herald's one, and the media scene in general last Thursday. A reported billionaire who's only just bought a stake in the NZME company has told them he has the support of other shareholders to replace the existing board almost entirely and put himself and as yet unknown others on it as soon as the NZME AGM at the end of next month. Michael Wood, speaking on behalf of the main journalist union E2, spelled out the staff's fears like this.
And the concern here is that we clearly have an individual who is highly motivated to take control of a major media entity in New Zealand, who is doing so quite clearly with the intent of promulgating a particular political perspective.
And Michael Wood went further on RNZ's morning report on Friday, saying that big money men from North America had ruined news media there and in other places, and they were only getting involved for their own political and ideological interests. Now, the name Jim Grenon was almost unknown, even in media circles, before this month. So how did it all get to the point that Michael Wood described this week like this?
The New Zealand Herald has often been thought of as New Zealand's paper of record, and we've never had a situation where a particular individual with a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of influence has said, yeah, I want that.
Last weekend here on Mediawatch, we mentioned a gossipy type of article in Rupert Murdoch's national paper across the Tasman, The Australian, that speculated wealthy Kiwis might be plotting to take over NZME. The article said that the chatter was based on its poor performance, and what it said was complaints from the business community over the quality of the publisher's content. The piece suggested new owners could shape the direction of the Herald, but only one was named, and that was Zuru Toys founder Nick Mowbray. But when local media asked Nick Mowbray if it was true, he said he wasn't interested. But the Australian's article also said others say a Canadian billionaire who resides in New Zealand is eager to get involved. And last week, the NZX was advised that a Takapuna-dwelling billionaire from Canada had spent about $9 million buying just over 9% of NZME. And not just any expat billionaire, but Jim Grenon, who's also helped fund alternative online news outlets, highly critical of mainstream media, and specifically the New Zealand Herald. On the newsroom site he now co-edits, former Herald editor Tim Murphy said this.
On the evidence of his existing media investments and enterprises, Jim Grenon presents a new type of moneyed influence, an activist part owner in the age of political and social rollback.
The statement supplied to the NZX said the shares are an investment and there was no current intention for a takeover bid, and Grenon himself told RNZ this week he has nothing to say about the decision to buy the NZME shares, at least for the time being. But it turns out change is coming at the Herald anyway, which he and others in business might approve of. When NZME revealed its latest annual results to investors recently, it also told them it wants to set a new tone.
NZME will also focus on taking a leadership position to help New Zealand thrive using its various platforms, including the New Zealand Herald, to support the reboot and acceleration of New Zealand's economic recovery, and sharing stories of success and building positive momentum.
Now that struck critics as close enough to the government's current messaging to give rise to concerns about editorial independence and reporting without fear or favour at the Herald. A bit less commented upon was another heads up that NZME gave to its investors last week, plans to roll out AI to shape the Herald's homepage. Now, that follows revelations last year by Mediawatch that the Herald had used AI to write editorials for its papers without telling the audience and without the oversight that its own policy demands for the use of the technology. So how might all this then change what we see and read in future from NZME and the Herald? Hayden Donnell's been investigating.
I put a series of questions to them, but they, understandably tight-lipped about this situation, said, "We don't have anything to add to our market statement. Our notice will go out ahead of the annual shareholder meeting as usual." So nothing much on that. The market statement's just saying that he has the support of 37% of shareholders to essentially take over the board, replace the directors.
Yeah, including, I think, one from the current board as part of the proposal, but we don't even know who these nominated directors are. And apparently one of the other shareholders has nominated a couple as well. And I think it's March the 11th, so next week, that the deadline for nominating directors for shareholders to consider is that deadline. Before that, as is now being described, high noon meeting right at the end of April.
Yeah, it's a showdown, NZME, high noon.
Yeah, well, it may not come to that. We'll see.
We'll see.
But in terms of, we heard Michael Wood just a moment ago in the program talking on behalf of Etu, the union, saying, the staff had these fears about possible political interference, change of direction that might come. Now, we've both talked to some staff at the Herald and NZME journalists. What have you heard from them about what they think about what's happening?
Yeah, the mood is pretty grim. I was at a leaving do, because obviously they're going through some of these redundancies right now. They're going through a pretty brutal restructure. And something someone said to me was, this was meant to be a wake for the people that are leaving, and it's turned into a wake for the people that are staying. So,
oh boy.
I mean, that's a fair indication. They saw this as essentially a hostile takeover of the company. They thought that he would make an effort to buy it out and become the owner. Who knows? Maybe that's the case. When I read that statement about no current plans to make a takeover bid, I thought it might be heavy emphasis on the current. Maybe if he didn't get these directorship spots that he's looking for, maybe then he would launch a full-scale takeover bid. I was reliably informed by people better positioned than myself that actually that statement is pretty carefully worded to avoid triggering legislation that governs company takeovers, so
yeah,
that you have a bit of flexibility.
One thing we don't really know is it will have to be tested whether he says he has the support, Mr. Grenon, of 37% of the shareholders. The shareholding of NZME is pretty diverse. There are a lot of shareholders, including sort of third-party, possibly disinterested ones, fund. I talked to some journalists about whether the company shareholders might hold the line on structure and feel that was best for the company, because directors have to represent, the best interests of the company. There is real worry, and there are discussions going on right now about, red lines about the separation of church and state, interference and from the governance and the editorial and the management. Individually, people are also talking about what they would consider to be changes that they wouldn't be prepared to stomach and carry on working in news. What one journalist said to me was, well, if they're going to do this and, have a political leaning that appears to, go with Jim Grenon and his supporters, well, good luck getting 150,000 digital subscribers for that, because, whilst these might be concerns or things that some in the media critics feel have been ignored or suppressed or whatever by mainstream media organisations such as the Herald, it's not a recipe for a broad-based
isn't it telling, right, that Jim Grenon did found the centrist, he founded NZME, obviously a deliberate provocation to NZME, so this is potentially a grudge that he's had, that these views that are in the centrists about vaccines, about climate change, about Te Tiriti, about whatever, are not reflected in, it seems like, NZME, and is now trying to get involved in the company and potentially take it over.
Well, more than that, I mean, Grenon even reportedly backed Chantal Baker, the influencer and provocateur, let's call her, in a defamation proceeding against the Herald. And if you look at the content of the centrist website now, which we gather Jim Grenon is no longer involved, even though he helped to found it, some of it is actually nitpicking individual stories and criticising individual stories in the Herald. And it does so, most of its content is anonymous. It does run columns from the likes of Graham Adams that are named, Ian Wishart, so kind of contrary viewpoints, to sum it up crudely. They've put their name to it, but the rest of it, there's no complaints process, there's no accountability such as there is for the Herald. So that is, again, what journalists are concerned about.
Obviously, these sites have been founded with a bone to pick. You wonder whether he's founded them as an alternative to NZME and found that they're not actually that popular, so is now actually turning his sites on, taking over an existing media company with an existing audience, right? But if there's not really a huge audience for those views, then maybe that doesn't make economic sense to the rest of the directorship. Now, that would be something that might make a takeover bid relatively difficult. But in the end, money speaks, right? And if the rest of them can't see an economic future in it, then maybe that does make it a little bit more difficult. But yeah, money talks. He's got, we've seen Elon Musk massively overpay for Twitter, not for reasons of economic sense necessarily, but because he wanted his personal ideological project to be played out on that platform. So it's not unprecedented for really wealthy individuals to be throwing their weight around.
Yeah, and this has is a scenario that's been talked about, that context of what Jeff Bezos, for example, had done. I mean, he owns the Washington Post lock, stock and barrel, so not quite the same as having a 10% or less than shareholding in a company like NZME. But sure, so I, for example, talked to a North American person who'd been involved in media ownership and digital and tech ventures, lives in New Zealand here, asked him about Grenon and whether he was familiar. He didn't really know the name, said he doesn't have a profile when he was building wealth in Canada of being involved in media or even politics, especially, and other issues such as they knew about. But having seen the news, this person told me there's no way that guy would be getting involved if he didn't want to have some sort of influence or scope for his own beliefs about what's missing in the media and discussion of social issues and stuff like that. There is another scenario that is also, I know, being talked about among journalists at NZME, which is, as you mentioned when you discussed NZME's results that came out last month, possibly splitting off the One Roof part of NZME, that's the property news and advertising and information portal. That could be quite profitable. Now, if that is split off from the company, leaving the kind of news and other radio assets more isolated, they might be cheaper to acquire. So if the company does evolve in that direction...
that was something that was actually speculated about. Jim Grenon is less interested in that One Roof asset, which is actually a massive money maker for the company, and might be more interested in the editorial assets for other reasons.
So the results were announced, and this change of tone, direction and economic positivity and so on, that may have persuaded him to take the shareholding and then move it on with control. Or maybe when they made that change, Jim Grenon was thinking, look, that's not enough, and we need more.
Or maybe when they made that change, this was already happening in the background and bubbling away in the background, and people knew that he's sniffing about, and maybe it was an early acquiescence to him. I mean, that's another
and indeed
possibility.
The Australian newspaper that sort of floated this story in that gossipy way last month, which turns out to have been closer to what's happened than people realised at the time, certainly indicated that sort of thinking was going on, long before. This week I interviewed Bryce Edwards, for example, about his newly formed Integrity Institute. We'll put that in the program next week to hear about that. But, he says this outfit of his wants to be a watchdog on media as well as business and politics. So seeing as that's part of their mission, so I asked him about when Grenon had taken a stake, but before the possibility of a takeover had been announced. But I asked him just in general terms if a politically motivated billionaire buying into NZME at that point in a minority way was something that worried him.
Oh, it does. I mean, the first thing to point out that this isn't anything new. The Herald or NZME is privately owned and always has been, and the ownership shifts around a bit, and I think it's always probably best when that ownership is quite fragmented.
If you go back 20 years, the company was called APN, it was Irish billionaire Tony O'Reilly who owned it.
Exactly. So But yeah, if you're having owners that have a very activist orientation coming on board, perhaps wanting seats on the NZME board and want to push the media in a particular way, as we've seen with Jeff Bezos, that is alarming for democracy. But again, not anything necessarily new, and it needs scrutiny from other media. And certainly the Integrity Institute will be looking at what Grenon, his influence on NZME might be. He has a critical stance towards the current media landscape, and because we have some huge problems in the media with public trust declining, a sense of maybe the media stuck in a bubble. To some extent, maybe it's good to have some outsiders coming in, mixing things up a bit.
Bryce Edwards, I mean, he can be a contrarian at times. He thinks the media needs a bit more diversity of thought and opinion, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but clear concerns about the fact that it's money talking here, and it's big money, and,
The NZME generally has probably a more right sympathetic editorial line, especially Newstalk ZB, but there is still a real connection to reality and a huge long history and a proud history of factual reporting at the Herald. And then when you're saying stuff about vaccines or about questioning climate science, about not getting the other side of climate science, well, that's something that, for instance, Stuff has already said, well, we're not going to tell the other side of climate science because we have such a wealth of scientific evidence that this is reality, that this is truth. And even if people don't believe it, then we are going to report the truth because that's our primary goal. And so if there's something different coming in there, then that will probably rankle quite a few of the editorial staff.
Well, on that, I also asked Bryce Edwards of the newly formed Integrity Institute, formerly a Herald columnist himself. They regularly publish his stuff, in fact, every week. I asked him if he thought this new tone plan from the Herald could undermine its reputation and its integrity.
It's hard to read exactly what it means, but the way I interpret it is that they're going to be more positive about business, champion the private sector more.
Do you think that's a way of pleasing their investors?
Yeah, quite possibly.
Or is it the advertisers, their readers?
It's hard to know, isn't it? And it would be good to get some answers from them on that. Media's always had different audiences that aren't just the readership. Often it is the advertisers, the owners, the friends in high places of the newsroom. The media at times, including the Herald, have had a mixed record on that. There's a lot of Herald journalists that have been spectacularly scrutinising of the powerful, and that still happens today. There's great journalists there. But no, I'm a bit worried about where the Herald's going.
Yeah, so he says as he said, they're worried about where the Herald is going. The Herald need to clarify what this new editorial direction really means about economic positivity. So you put that directly to the Herald. They wouldn't be interviewed about it to NZME. What was the statement we got back on that?
Yeah, it said the editorial advocacy campaign will be focused on inspiring stories of Kiwi success and progress. The campaign is non-partisan and will see us using our platforms to help New Zealand thrive, build positivity and support the reboot of New Zealand's economic recovery. Now, they compared it to advocacy stuff they've done in the past. That includes the 90% project. So that was an editorial campaign aimed at getting New Zealand to 90% vaccinated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, so talking to people in the Herald, for one thing, on that 90% project, there was a joke last night that maybe they'll have to start the Grenon era with a Tamato porno-style apology for the 90% project. Also, talking to people within the Herald, there was some optimism that maybe their existing work would just be sort of shoehorned into this editorial campaign, that it wouldn't be a big cheerleading for economic recovery initiatives carried out by the government or anything like that. The thing is with this, it could just be NZME is a commercial company. It has a distinct interest in the economic recovery of this country because that helps it stay afloat and employ journalists and do reporting. So it could just be that.
Yeah, in 2022, there was a kind of post-COVID series, or that was the tone of it, a building back of our economy and society. So that went on for several months. Some of the Herald's business staff ran that. It was called New Zealand Rebuilding Better. But that was different, I think, because that was about identifying problems that had been discussed and saying we're going to put a lot of effort to really confronting, really discussing them. Whereas this thing sounds more like going out looking for the positive stuff and amping that up, which would be almost a contrary perspective perspective about, well, as literally as the Herald's statement in its annual results said, amplifying positive economic success.
Even that wording in the release that they gave to me, support the reboot of New Zealand's economic recovery, that sounds too much like a PR line to really not chafe with actual journalists, I think.
The other thing that also came out of NZME's annual results presentation was using AI to sort of edit and construct the Herald's homepage. How would that work? And you asked the company that too, didn't you, about how exactly they're going to use AI for the homepage?
They were a bit vague about this, but they did say there will always be human oversight across all content and sections of the homepage. They're always going to be curated by editors. We constantly review our automation tools based on newsroom expertise and evaluation. I asked specifically what it's actually going to look like, and that's not quite clear. Now, from talking to people that are connected to the Herald, now it could be that AI will be kind of reordering or ordering 80% of the site, and you've got 20% human curated, and that potentially it'll mean that viewing the Herald site will be different for each person depending on their preferences. So for instance, if you go to the site, Colin, and you're always clicking on Harry and Meghan stories,
right,
which is pretty true to life,
okay,
you'll be served up maybe 15 of those stories, and because that's so it's kind of like a social media algorithm situation,
but
potentially.
Don't both, like the likes of Stuff and NZME, they already encourage users to customize their homepage so that you can get news from your region. Isn't it possible that using AI like this to construct the homepage could end up kind of just doing that for you, which sounds like it wouldn't really change the flow or flood of news that was presented to you, and then, by virtue of analytics, the sort of news that they decide to pursue in the future at the expense of other kind of news?
I think the concern is if it ends up backgrounding really important stuff that humans still want, just journalists still want to foreground. And I mean, I edited the Herald homepage for a few years, and just as a deputy homepage editor. And during that time, they introduced a program called Chartbeat, which basically showed us which stories were performing and which weren't. And it was really tough. It's really addictive, those numbers. When you see the green arrow pointing up, you really want to elevate a story. But if I had just done that, if I had just gone with the green arrow pointing up, the homepage would look pretty trashy. If there's a concern with this, it's potentially you end up prioritizing stories that aren't necessarily important but are clickable based on metrics. But there should still be this human curation aspect where you're trying to serve people their veggies even if they really don't want to eat them. Mm-hmm. And maybe that sounds a bit paternalistic.
Yeah, I was going to say, people,
so
the algorithm's more democratic than...
Yeah, exactly. Reveal preferences. But I think actually there is an important role for editorial choices and trying to foreground and stuff that's democratically important, that serves society, that has all these noble goals behind it. And if you're just doing an algorithm, well, we've seen the problems with that, with something like Twitter or Facebook, where if you just drive for engagement or you drive for clickability, you might end up serving people's kind of darker impulses for conflict. But the AI is getting pretty smart, and there's some nuance there, right? Because they won't just be prioritizing for clicks, they will be prioritizing for conversions, which is an industry speak way of saying converting people to premium subscriptions. And that's a different type of content than just your favorite Harry and Meghan style of stories. And it might be, Simon Wilson's analysis of local politics, or Thomas Coughlan doing an economic analysis of a policy that the government's come up with. So that stuff will still be prioritised even by an AI algorithm, I'd think.
So the Herald statement on that seems to say we'll still have human oversight. That hasn't changed, but it's still basically trust us with the tech. But they are going to use AI because it's there and it will be efficient.
Well, talking to people there, they thought it might be just kind of a supercharged version of something that's already there called recommended stories. I think you get them down the bottom of the story, you'll see like recommended reads or whatever. And those are based on your previous clicks and your preferences. So it could be that essentially you're rolling that out to the entire site.
And look, finally, whether it's NZME's use of its AI technology and a change in that they announced with their latest results, or this policy of editorial economic positivity, or the matter of the ownership and possible challenges to it by James Grenon and other shareholders, it's been really hard to get people to talk about this. Almost nobody wants to talk about any of these aspects on the record. I mean, often when it's staff, that's understandable, but because maybe people don't want to speculate or be proven wrong.
I think the precarity of the news media at the moment means that probably people don't want to speak out of fear of losing their last remaining connection to having a job. They don't want to speak out of turn because their companies are vulnerable to takeovers. There really is, it's such a tipping point, a moment of change in the industry that, people are fearful.
Indeed. Well, the next step, the nomination for candidates for directors, that's middle of next week. That AGM, high noon, as we heard about earlier, that's the end of April. So by then, I guess we really will find out whether it's likely that there could be a change of control at the top of the company and whether there's support for the plan. So we'll follow the story as it develops, as they say.
Lovely to talk to you, Colin.
And she said, no, I'm going to diversify, as they always do, diversify my media offering. How's it going down in Wellington?
Well, I think it obviously comes on the back of a poll result which shows her personal rating at, I think, minus 42.
That was the former mayor of Purerua, Nick Leggett, on Newstalk ZB last week, talking about Wellington's current mayor, Tory Whanau, pulling out of regular interviews on the network's Wellington Morning Show. That was something we discussed in Midweek Mediawatch last week. It's in our podcast feed if you missed it. But last week, Nick Leggett also told Newstalk ZB it was a strange decision for a mayor who wants to be re-elected in the capital.
Wellington Mornings with Nick Mills is a top-rated show in Wellington. Nick has done a great job of building the audience over time, and people do listen. So it is surprising, and it does seem as though in an election year it would be odd to want to really deny yourself an audience of several thousand people of a morning and one that you'd be trying to win over.
Now, Nick Leggett didn't mention it there, but he himself has filled in for the regular host Nick Mills on the Wellington Morning Show earlier in the summer. And coincidentally, another topic that Nick Leggett discussed in that same slot on the ZB Drive show last week was how the Prime Minister handled media questions about whether he'd have sacked his just-resigned Commerce Minister, Andrew Bailey. And he didn't handle it well, according to Nick Leggett.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What have you got to lose?
So he didn't have anything to lose by looking
I
very decisive.
Exactly. I wondered the same thing. Why would it have hurt to have said yes in that situation?
But fast forward 1 week to last Tuesday, it was the Prime Minister being asked on RNZ's Morning Report if he'd make a move on an important entity led by Nick Leggett.
Hey, just finally, we're almost out of time. What are you going to do about Wellington Water? Is there any scope for you to step in there?
Well, we've got clarity in terms of our local water done well, and as I said yesterday, Wellington Water is a total basket case. It hasn't been running as a proper CCO model, and they need to adopt proper governance structure and a proper entity structure.
Wellington Water, which is owned by the Wellington Region's councils, was the subject of 2 eye-opening and just-released reports that were in the headlines that day. Now, as the PM was saying that on Morning Report, Wellington's councillors were meeting urgently to consider what to do about it. And Nick Leggett himself had already been on Morning Report, answering questions about his leadership of Wellington Water and his own future.
Nick Leggett told Morning Report he's talking to the local councils which own Wellington Water about whether he should step down.
But the embattled chair of Wellington Water has so far resisted strong calls in the media to step down. But it's not as if there hasn't been a shortage of other resignations from national organisations for the media to report on this week, including Checkpoint on Thursday.
So, Joe, Adrian Orr, Greg Foran and the sacking of Phil Goff, all in just 24 hours. Doesn't really scream stability, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't, Lisa, and certainly a lot of unanswered questions on a couple of them as well.
Now, on ZB last Wednesday, they were right in the middle of a chat about just how easy it is to spend $1,000 on groceries these days.
So a lot of people do try to buy in bulk these days because it's more economical not to travel and not to...
Thank you so much for your call, Karen.
When this happened.
Yeah, this is big news. And breaking news, New Zealand's Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr, he has resigned and will finish at the end of the month.
Big news indeed. Newstalk ZB followed up with the online headline, Shock and Awe. But talking about it on RNZ's panel 4 hours later, Wallace Chapman gave Adrian Orr a rapid promotion to go with his resignation.
What marked his time as Governor-General, Bernard?
Firstly,
Reserve Bank
when he
Governor,
got in from...
And it turns out that wasn't the only resignation that day in the media. Mike Hosking kicked off his ZB breakfast on school lunches.
A sandwich and an apple is still a thing. It's still real.
But the same morning, Richard Prebble had broken the news about himself in his weekly New Zealand Herald column, which was starkly headlined, Why I've Resigned from the Waitangi Tribunal. Now, that was behind the Herald premium content paywall, but for those without a subscription, Mike Hosking read most of it out on the air, adding his own endorsement at the end.
It is time for the Prime Minister to lead and uphold that there is one treaty, one country, and one citizenship. Good on Richard Prebble, Hero of the Week, 9 to 8.
However, this was news too beyond the Herald NZME stable. Stuff's catch-up story later in the day was headlined, Richard Prebble, Why I Joined the Waitangi Tribunal and Why I Quit. Less than a week earlier, Pharmac boss Sarah Fitt also quit, with lots of her term still to go. But like Adrian Orr, she faced political and public criticism of how she'd done the job. RNZ reported that her resignation followed a submission presented to Parliament's Health Select Committee last December, which was, they said, built off a 100,000 signature petition calling for her to be sacked. But it turns out the submission in question was from the lobby group Patient Voice Aotearoa, and that six-figure signature petition was from 2021, and it urged the Minister of Health to conduct a review of Pharmac and double its budget. Now, that submission, written 3 years later, did say Chief Executive Sarah Fitt was no longer fit for the role. But that's not quite the same as 100,000 people demanding that she go. That's an awful lot of people putting their names to a demand to get rid of a public servant that you'd think few people would actually know by name. Now, it turns out that Patient Voice Aotearoa's Malcolm Mulholland did launch a separate online petition that did explicitly demand the dismissal of Chief Executive Sarah Fitt, along with the entire Pharmac board. That was in October 2023. But that petition got less than 1,500 signatures. Now, maybe it doesn't make much difference, but after the resignations of 4 top health officials in just under 1 month, those who want to step up into one of the most important roles might not want to hear if 100,000 Kiwis wanted them sacked from the job when they really didn't. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts to share or ideas for us to follow up, or you spot anything you think we should know about, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Hayden Donnell will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Mediawatch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Mediawatch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.